I sat in that room for 11 days, just the two of us, and in all that time, not one other person walked through that door. My name is Harold. I'm 74 years old, and what I watched happen to my oldest friend in the last days of his life is something I have not been able to put down since. George and I had known each other since we were 19. We met in the first week of university, standing in the same registration line, both of us annoyed about something neither of us can remember now. We became friends the way young men do when they have nothing and everything at the same time, quickly, carelessly, with no idea what we were building. We studied different things, ended up in different cities, married different women, lived entirely different lives, but for 55 years, we stayed close. Phone calls, visits when we could manage them, letters before everyone stopped writing letters. He was the kind of friend you could go 8 months without speaking to and then pick up exactly where you left off, without explanation and without awkwardness. I don't think I fully understood how rare that was until I was sitting beside his hospital bed, watching him breathe. George was, by every measurable standard, a successful man. He had built a company from almost nothing in his late 20s and sold it for more than either of us ever thought was real money. He had a house that people described the first time they saw it. He had been written about in publications. He had awards, recognitions, the kind of accumulated professional respect that takes decades to build. His name was on a building at the university where we first met. I used to joke with him about that. I told him it was the most expensive way I had ever seen a man try to make sure people remembered his name. He laughed at that. George laughed easily, which was one of the things I loved most about him. But looking back now, I wonder whether the laughing was also a way of not answering. He had been married twice. The first marriage ended when his children were still young, and I watched that happen from a distance, knowing enough to understand that the distance George kept from his family was not cruelty, it was habit. He simply did not know how to be present in the way a home requires. He was always oriented outward, toward the next thing, the next project, the next version of himself he was building. His second wife was a kind woman who I think genuinely loved him. They were together for nearly 18 years. She passed 4 years before he did, and after that, George became quieter in a way I had not seen in him before. When I got the call that he was in hospital and that it was serious, I drove 6 hours without thinking twice. That is what you do. That is what 55 years means. I arrived and he was awake, uncomfortable, but himself. We talked for hours that first evening. About nothing important, about everything, the way old friends do when they both understand without saying it that the clock is no longer abstract. I went back to my hotel that night, expecting that his children would arrive the next morning. He had 3, a daughter and 2 sons. I had met them over the years at different points. Christmas gatherings he hosted when the children were still young, a wedding, a funeral. They were adults now, with their own lives, their own distances. I assumed they were on their way. I assumed the room would fill. It didn't. By the 3rd day, I understood that no one was coming. His daughter called twice that week. I know because I was in the room when the phone rang, and I watched George's face each time, the way it shifted into something careful and composed, the way he asked about her children and listened and said the right things and never once said what I think he actually wanted to say. His sons did not call while I was there. I don't know whether they called at other times. I didn't ask. It wasn't my place to ask. What I can tell you is that for 11 days I was the only person in that room. I want to be careful here, because I am not telling you this to make you feel contempt for his children. I don't know what happened between them. I don't know what years of distance and silence and absence look like from the other side, from the side of a child who grew up with a father who was always half somewhere else. I genuinely don't know. George was not a confiding man, and there were whole territories of his interior life he never opened to me, and I respected that. But I noticed things over 55 years. I noticed the way he talked about his children in a register that was proud but not intimate. I noticed that he knew their accomplishments but sometimes fumbled on details that a father who had been truly present would have known automatically. I noticed that he spoke about them the way you speak about people you care about from a distance, which is different from the way you speak about people you have truly lived alongside. On the 8th day, he was weaker, and we talked less. I sat beside him, and we watched the light change in the window, and I read to him from a book he had on his nightstand, a history of something. I can't even remember what now. It doesn't matter. At one point he looked at me and said, "Harold, I don't think I built the right things." And I didn't know what to say to that. I don't think he was asking me to disagree with him. I think he was just finally saying it out loud after a very long time of it living only inside him. I said, "You built a lot, George." He said, "I know. That's what I mean." I have turned that exchange over in my mind more times than I can count since then. I don't sleep the way I used to. I wake at 2 or 3 in the morning, and I lie there, and I think about that room, about how quiet it was, about the nurses who were kind but efficient, about the window and the light, and the two of us, 2 old men, one of them dying, and the almost unbearable smallness of what was actually there in that room after a life that had, by every external account, been very large. George died on the 11th day, early in the morning before I had arrived. A nurse called me at the hotel. I went back and I sat with him for a little while anyway, even though he was gone. It felt wrong to just leave. I drove home 6 hours the same way I had driven there, alone with it. And what I have been carrying since, what keeps pulling me awake in the night, is not grief exactly. Though there is grief, it is a question. It is the question of what kind of life actually produces people who will not leave your room, not people who feel obligated to come, not people who show up because it is the right thing and they would feel guilty otherwise, but people who come because the thought of you being alone in that place is something they simply cannot tolerate. People who rearrange their lives without hesitation. People who sit with you for 11 days because where else would they be? I have been asking myself honestly whether I have built that, whether the people in my life, my children, my wife, the friends I've kept over the years, whether they would come not out of duty, but out of something deeper and more unshakable than duty. And the honest answer is that I don't know, and the not knowing has changed the way I move through my days. I think most of us spend our lives building things we can measure. Money, titles, reputations, square footage, the respect of people we admire, and those things are not meaningless. I am not standing here telling you that ambition is a disease or that success is a trap. George's life was not a wasted life. I want to be clear about that. But I think there is a different kind of building that most of us treat as secondary, as the soft backdrop to the real work of our lives. The building that happens in ordinary evenings at home when you choose to be present instead of somewhere else in your mind. The building that happens when you ask your child a question and then actually listen to the answer instead of waiting to respond. The building that happens when you let someone see you honestly, without the performance, without the careful management of how you are perceived. That kind of building is slow, and it is quiet, and it does not produce anything you can put in a publication or hang on a wall. But I think it is the only kind that fills a room at the end. I am 74 years old. I have more years behind me than ahead, and I know that, and I'm at peace with that in the way that you eventually have to be. But I'm not at peace with the idea of that room. I'm not at peace with the idea of lying somewhere at the end of a long life and having the silence be that complete. And so I have made a decision, not a dramatic one, not the kind of thing you announce, but a quiet internal reorientation toward the people who are already in my life, to call more often, to listen longer, to say the things I feel instead of assuming that they are understood, to be, in whatever time I have left, less impressive and more present. George was my oldest friend. I loved him. I am glad I was there. But I think the greatest gift he gave me was not in anything he said, not even in those 8 words on the 8th day. It was in what I sat inside for 11 days and could not look away from. Some lessons you cannot learn from the outside. Some things you only understand when you are in the room.